Hello, good morning, and welcome to our webinar to kick off this academic year. It's the first in one of three events that we'll be having with the schools focus, and today we're going to be talking about parental complaints. My name is Jenny Arrowsmith. I'm a partner here at Irwin Mitchell, and I'm in the employment team. And I'm going to introduce my colleagues in just a moment. But before I do, if you're not already aware of the wider series that we'll be running this autumn, there's a QR code there where you can just scan that and it will give you all of the dates coming up. So we've got today, obviously, on parental complaints, then we've got one on DSAR data, and then one on SEND. And my two colleagues who you'll be seeing today will be supporting those events. So I hope you find these three series of events really useful. We will be asking for your feedback as well, and we welcome any comments and suggestions for further topics so that we can be supporting you in your role as school leaders. So next slide, please, Lisa. So as I say, my name's Jenny, partner in Irwin Mitchell. My area of specialism is employment law, but I also lead our education sector. I'll just pass over to my colleague Joanne and Esther. If you want to just give a little bit of an intro to yourselves, your practice areas, I think that would be really useful.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm Joanne and I'm a partner in our data protection team. I've been a data protection lawyer for over 20 years, so before anyone had the slightest interest in it. So yeah, it's been one of my things that I've been focusing on for a long time now. Esther.
Thanks, Joanne. My name's Esther Salter. I'm a legal director at Irwin Mitchell. I head up our education law team nationally, and I also look after the public law team in our Gatwick and Brighton offices. I mostly act for parents and children and schools, but in a previous life, I also worked in-house for a local authority. So I've seen every side of the coin in terms of education law.
Thank you. Okay, so one more QR. Well, obviously you can see our connections there. If you want to link in on the QR codes there, it'll take you to our LinkedIn pages. You will get a copy of these slides, so please do connect in with us, and you can keep up to date with all sorts of legal updates that we always post on our LinkedIn pages. As well as in the feedback form. So next slide, please, Lisa. At the feedback form, which you'll see here, we'll be asking for your feedback towards the end of the event, but also if you don't already subscribe to our education newsletter, there's an opportunity to do that using that feedback form. Okay, so let's crack on then. So a bit of context setting. We know just from the work that we do collectively for our clients that parental complaints are very difficult, stressful. They seem more voluminous, potentially more vexatious in some instances, but they certainly seem to be more of them around. And that's what we hear from our clients, and we're being increasingly asked to support on them. And that's really why we thought we would focus on this topic this morning. When looking at some statistics just to see if that was a wider trend and not just our own observation, I think that it's fair to say that it is. So 65% of school leaders reported an increase in parental complaints during the academic year 23-24. Some schools say parents are using multiple channels, and I'd be interested to hear whether that's something that you're feeling and experiencing too. For schools to deal with and navigate how to deal with those complaints. 83% of school leaders said they've seen a rise in vexatious complaints, and they're the ones that we see are perhaps excessive, unreasonable perhaps in approach or their demands, and are baseless in what they're asking for. And Esther's going to talk us through vexatious complaints later on in this session. Leaders also describe the job as increasingly impossible under the current pressures. This is another thing that they need to deal with. And whilst there may be some very valid reasons for the complaints, we need to make sure that they're dealt with in an appropriate way that is both supportive of what the school needs to do, understanding and responding to the concerns that parents may be raising, and supporting staff along the way. So I'll be picking up on that in as far as the staffing issues during the course of today. And then Joanne will be talking about the impact of data, because we're increasingly seeing an increase in data subject access requests as part of complaints. Some are reasonable, some are not, and Joanne will be talking you through the full scope of that and how to deal with that. Okay, so that's a little bit of context setting, but we thought before we get cracking, we thought we might just put it out to you and hear what your thoughts are. So if you've got a phone handy, it'd be really useful if you could just scan in, using that scanning code, you'll get to a page on Slido, or you could just type in slido.com. You don't need to download anything at all. It'll ask you for a hashtag, and the hashtag is parental complaints. We're just going to ask you 3 questions, really, just to see if your perceptions are what we're seeing, or if there's anything different, and then we can feed that into the discussion that we're going to be having this morning. So I'll just give you a moment to get that started, and then we're going to move on to the Slido page. So there we are. Thank you. So are parental complaints on the rise compared to 3 years ago? What do we think? So almost everybody is saying, yes, there has been an increase. And what's reassuring actually, a lot of you are saying, despite a significant increase, it's manageable. Oh, it's changing 50-50 now. Okay, so overwhelmingly, there definitely is an increase. Some of you are finding it significant, and probably I would imagine that takes its toll somewhat. And some are saying that it's manageable, which is great, because that would, I suggest, mean that you've got some good processes and practices in place. But hopefully today, whether you're finding that it's unmanageable or manageable, you'll take away some tips of how to deal with these, and just reflect on your own internal processes. Great. Still moving along quite a lot, but I think it's settled on significant increase. Okay, next one then. So the next question is, have you seen an increase in the use of DSARs, so that's data subject access requests, as part of a complaint? So this would be, for example, straight into significant increase there. This would be, for example, where parents are demanding lots of data to be provided as part of the request, going hand in hand. And data requests can be very difficult to navigate. Okay, so very strongly at the moment, a significant increase. So Joanne, I'll come back to you on that one. I think Joanne will probably agree that that's what she's seen as well, but okay, yeah, she's nodding. Okay, great. And then finally, an open question, really. We'd be interested to hear from you, what are the key themes in the complaints that you're receiving? So obviously no personal details or anything, but if you had to put a theme on it, is it behaviour? Is it discipline? Is it send? Is it something else? What kind of themes are coming through? And the pressure points, I suppose, from you as school leaders in responding to them. That would also be useful if you just want to write what you're feeling. We will try and reflect on that as well. So I'll just give you a moment to do that. Send and behaviour coming through. I'm assuming, with the exception of one person who's talking about staff behaviour, it's probably mostly about children's behaviour, but it might be both. I don't know. Yeah, one for you, Esther, there. Interesting you say about parental mental health. I've seen that quite a lot as well. So where the parents are not coping particularly well, in the way that pours out into how they deal with things within the school setting. Yeah, so there's a lot there, Esther, in relation to your area, and I'll come to you in a sec, just for your thoughts and reflections on that. So now is probably a good time, whilst it's in my mind at least, just to say that the third of this series will focus on SEND. And Esther can perhaps tell us in a moment the kind of things that she'll be talking about in that, just to give you a 1 minute sort of intro to that, which might be a bit reassuring because it sounds like that's definitely an area of need. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Let's move back to the slides then for this session. If you have any questions at all during the course of this session, please do put them in the chat. We will try our very best to deal with them as we go through today. If we don't, or there's something you just wanted to pick up on offline, please put it in your feedback form and we will go through all of those and we will get back in touch. So please do not hesitate to ask anything. So the key themes that we identified are these, which resonate really. The three at the top seem to be the biggest areas, with special education needs, support and behaviour and discipline coming out quite strongly as the key areas where there's a flow of parental complaints and concerns. So at this point, I was just going to hand over to Esther. Esther, I don't know if you've got any general observations in relation to that. Obviously, your world is very busy in the world of SEND, which is why we were going to have that separate session. And in a minute, I'm going to ask you to talk through the complaints process. But before we do, I don't know if you've got any thoughts and reflections on what's just come through.
Well, yeah, I wasn't surprised to see the number in the Slido of SEND coming up time and time again, and that is absolutely what we see when we're acting for schools. And I mean, the reality is that the complaints process is usually the forerunner to the legal process. So we do get involved with schools and colleges at the complaint process stage, and there's definitely lots that are linked to it can be SEND and behaviour. But of course, as the Slido rightly, as some of the comments rightly point out, that usually the two are inextricably linked. So suspensions, exclusions can be a recurring theme in terms of upset parents, but certainly lack of SEND support is a really big issue. And certainly when I act for parents and children, complaints processes are something we use on a regular basis, less so for schools, but more for local authorities. But I'm definitely seeing schools being swamped with formal complaints and sometimes quite vexatious ones, which I know we're going to talk about. But it's about getting them right, and I'm hopefully I'm going to be able to talk you through how to make sure you are getting the process right and what it needs to look like.
Great. And just before we hand over to that then, Esther, do you think there's any particular reasons why it's increasing? I mean, is it that there's, I don't know, there must be some reason why we're seeing more and more complaints. Is it a systematic thing, a funding thing?
I think it's all of it. I think we talk about the SEND system being in crisis. We know it is. We've just had the government select committee paper out looking at how we need to really quite radically reform the SEND system. The notional budget at £6,000 is a joke. We are asking too much of the school system, and it is struggling. And you cannot deal with it in the current circumstances. So I think we are setting schools up to fail, unfortunately. And I also think AI might be also helping out with the number of complaints coming through. People are very keen to be using technology to help bash a complaint out now.
We're seeing that on the employment side, actually, which is a different story, but with grievances and the like. So AI definitely is helping. So it's an aid, isn't it, to help people, but also I think it's meaning some of the complaints come through in a way that isn't helping us to address the concerns in a reasonable way, and also to understand the concerns. So yeah.
I think social media, Jenny, as well, is taking its toll. And I think, there was just an article this week on sort of parental WhatsApp groups and how it can really get people quite angry and militant,
riled up.
And actually they're not very helpful places to be. And I think, they're not, perhaps they're contributing to some of these complaints.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's try and put a more positive look on things in terms of what we can control, because it seems that there's a lot of issues to deal with. But perhaps if we hand over to you now then, Esther, if you talk us through the stages and best practices for dealing with complaints, I'd be really grateful. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Next slide, please. So I mean, some of these are quite obvious, but I've just set out a few of the stages and the best practices that I think it's important to be aware of. I do see quite a variety of the quality of complaints procedures from schools, and I think what I would say is, you know, that sometimes it's only 2 stages. I think that's all you actually have to have, but I think 3 stages is really quite helpful to have. It's really useful to have a less formal stage, because sometimes you can really nip a complaint in, you know, the bud, and just, you know, if you a conversation, a quick meeting could resolve things really quite quickly. It's really important for there to be clear time limits set out in a complaint for dealing with it, for progressing it, and also the different options for escalation. What is considered to be normal is around 3 months for someone to bring a complaint and, you know, to lodge it. And I think that additional time can be given in exceptional circumstances, but that is the general thought. That's actually a bit shorter than, for instance, the local government and social care ombudsman. You know, those complaints and local authority complaints is normally 12 months, so a little bit shorter for school complaints. You can include a cut-off time for raising a complaint, for escalating it as well to the next stage. That is important information. It's often forgotten on the complaint responses, and I would say it's also really important when a complaint comes in to make sure it's acknowledged and that you're setting those expectations from the get-go. I would say that any decision you know, that a school makes, also you need to think about it. It's got to be you've got to think about the procedure being fair, reasonable and flexible, and that you can't be applying blanket policies. You really need to deal with every complaint on its own merit. There are certain legal principles that apply to school complaints, and those are the things I see all the time in the public law sphere, which are very normal for me, but really you have to make those decisions in line with education and other law, particularly human rights and equality law. And we just popped some links in the slides there to the Equalities Act and the Human Rights Act. And there's also the 7 principles of public law, which really should be adhered to. So we've got honesty, integrity, objectivity, accountability, selflessness, openness and leadership. Really important to be thinking about when addressing complaints. Next slide, please. So why is it important to have a robust complaints process? It sounds really obvious, but I think it's worth thinking about, well, if you don't have it, what could go wrong? So we talk about fostering trust and transparency between schools and the community. It's vital because actually the other end of that is breakdowns in relationship and also legal action. You can think about how things can go wrong. I'm certainly seeing an increase in legal action, discrimination cases, and really we need to, I suppose you need to know that there's procedures protecting staff from abuse and threats. Also, there's guidance on complaint resolution, and the government guidance, which I'll talk about further in a moment. It really does encourage resolving issues directly within the school before escalating to other authorities. So whether that's Department for Education or Ofsted, and again, we're going to look at those a little bit further on the different circumstances. You also need to think about the inclusive complaint eligibility, and that, you know, it can be made by anyone affected, and that's not just parents or carers. It could be someone who lives in the same road, it could be a member of the public, someone who's down the street from the school. Next slide, please. So there are some statutory requirements that need to be considered and followed in terms of dealing with or having a complaints procedure for a school. There's the ones for maintained schools, and there's also ones for academies. I've just put the relevant section for the Education Act, and then the Independent School Standard there with the links to those. But there's also some really useful best practice guidance that really sets out, you know, what needs to be included, and also what is included and what's not included. And again, I'll talk about scope in a moment. There's some helpful model complaints procedures made available there as well. I would say they're okay, they're not amazing. I spoke earlier about the fact that some of them only have a couple of stages. I like to have at least 3 stages if at all possible, so there's the informal option. Something that is important is this concept of transparency, and really that schools do need to publish the procedures or their complaints procedures, and they must define the scope of the complaints, and including related policies. There is also a duty to regularly review the complaints, and it's every 2 or 3 years, so that, you know, legislation changes, we don't sit still. All policies need regular review, and complaints procedures are included. Next slide, please. So I spoke earlier just about other options. There is the school complaint process, and usually that will be the right one, but there are other options available that parents may consider as well. There's the Secretary of State, the Department for Education, and Ofsted. There's all complaints procedures available there. Generally, for all 3 of those, you need to have exhausted the school's complaints process first, and they may not be appropriate or relevant. So for the Secretary of State, the scope of those complaints is very much limited to whether a school or governing body is acting unreasonably or has failed to exercise their duties under the Education Act. And then the Secretary of State can issue a formal direction if the complaint is upheld. That's quite different. Also, the Department for Education, again, as I said, you've got to follow the complaints process, but it's really going to look at, you know, has it failed to act according to its duties under education law? Has it acted unreasonably, or when the child's not receiving education or has been exposed to harm? But yeah, as I said, only after exhausting the internal one. And the Department for Education is very much limited to checking the school's adherence to legal duties, not resolving those individual complaints. And for private schools, the role is really involvement. It's more of a regulator and ensuring standards are met. Finally, Ofsted, again, they're going to be looking at a school as a whole rather than individual cases. So they'll be looking at the quality of the education being provided, including remote education, pupils' wellbeing and safety. And Ofsted normally expect parents, again, to resolve internal complaints first, and they don't investigate issues between individual parents and the school, nor do they resolve individual complaints. So just be aware of that. They can use the information, however, to inform future inspections and refer the complaint to the relevant authority. So it could be the police or social services or any kind of referral that comes out of that. Next slide, please. So it's important to understand what is and isn't covered in the complaints process. And so really you need to be aware of what you need to deal with and what you don't need to deal with. The scope really excludes certain areas. So you're not going to have to, or you're not expected to deal with complaints around admissions, exclusions, child protection. Those sort of areas are very much excluded, but there's more. There's school reorganisation proposals, statutory assessments for special education needs, any kind of matters that are likely to require a child protection investigation, exclusions. Obviously, there's an appeal process that needs to be followed for exclusions. Unless you're an independent school, then it usually is the complaints process. Obviously, not for maintained or academy schools. it's also whistleblowing, staff grievances, staff conduct complaints, disciplinary issues, complaints about services by the providers, complaints about the curriculum we mentioned earlier. You know, actually that's the more kind of Department for Education that would deal with that, and even complaints about collective worship. You'd be signposting to other sort of to local authority or the local standing advisory council for religious education, or the other relevant body, but those I think could be excluded. We've already mentioned about the curriculum being elsewhere, and I think clear communication on what you can and can't deal with is vital. So do let them know what the boundaries are and signpost them, just to manage the expectation for the complainant, and really that the benefit of clarity, you know, you can't really underestimate that it will help reduce the frustration of the complainant. So just set those expectations. Next slide, please. So I've put down a few tips on in terms of how, you know, handling complaints. Again, these seem really obvious, but I think emotion can get in the way. Sometimes people can get very close in terms of the circumstances of a complaint, so it's not always easy. But I suppose one of the most important things is about expressing empathy and trying to diffuse that emotion, acknowledge the complaint's feelings, loss of trust, and building understanding and rapport. Really, really vital. Seeing if you can move away from the complaint and move on. Inviting dialogue. You know, I was just mentioning about the stage one, having an informal complaints process. Really good to have those in-person discussions, clarify concerns and desired outcomes that can avoid your stage 2 or even your stage 3 and legal action. So I highly recommend using those. Maintaining transparency, I think that's a common theme. Keeping people informed and updated of the progress of their complaint, and also handling sensitive issues. So address discrimination claims, you know, particularly sensitively, and get some legal advice. These are kind of red flags that might go further, might lead to litigation. So just be aware of that. And also just in terms of, you know, if it is particularly complex complaint, you can ask for extra time to investigate it. Next slide, please. So there's such a massive range of remedies that can be utilised for dealing with complaints, and I've put down a few here. So it could be things like a simple apology. It could be conducting an investigation into whatever the specific issue is, but doing something proactive and positive, offering increased support or reasonable adjustments. It could be some compensation if you are going to uphold the complaint, some kind of gesture of goodwill. Appreciate that's quite a rare thing to do, but you know, it would have to be, you know, particularly you know, a particular set of circumstances. Could be a policy change or training for staff or the whole school to address concerns effectively. And what I would say is, those remedies that you can offer, those are all the remedies that you can be asking the first tier tribunal for a disability discrimination case. So if you're getting in there with remedies, actually, again, it could be avoiding litigation down the line. Proportionality is obviously key. So, you know, you're not going to be offering compensation for a really minor complaint, and or you know, policy changes or big staff training. You know, it'd have to be significant. So you need to ensure that the chosen resolution is proportionate to complaint, and just balancing that fairness, avoiding unnecessary admissions of liability. And I would say, if you're not sure and if you're worried about the complaint and the size of the complaint, that could be the time, obviously, to get a little bit of further advice, whether that's, you know, whether that's legal advice. It might be, you know, worth doing sooner rather than later. Restoring trust is really key with handling complaints. You know, something has gone wrong. Those effective remedies, they should be used to address those core issues and try to help rebuild trust. It can happen, it can work, and actually avoiding that breakdown in relationship is really important if you can. Next slide, please. Well, I think I'm handing over to Joanne to talk us through DSARs.
Thanks, Esther. So I'm going to talk about DSARs, and I think the one thing I will say, I think when Jenny mentioned it in terms of whether schools are experiencing greater volume of DSARs, I certainly agree with that. As I say, I've been doing data protection issues for a long time, and I think the volume of DSARs we're seeing now generally, but particularly in the education space, has massively increased over the last few years. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a look at some key issues in terms of how to manage DSARs, and this isn't an in-depth sort of discussion on DSARs, but it is a way to think about how you might be able to implement some of these things to manage them, and also to give you an idea of what the ICO's views are in relation to DSARs, because I think sometimes there's a little bit of a disconnect in terms of how the ICO sees DSARs, how DSARs are managed, and also how individuals making DSARs see DSARs. I think the first thing to bear in mind is, certainly from the ICO perspective, is they see DSARs as a way for individuals to access information, and they think that individuals are using it because they are genuinely interested in terms of the information that is held by an organisation, and they want to understand what that is. That's not our experience. Certainly our experience is that they are used mainly where things are quite contentious. People think that there's either a smoking gun, which there rarely is, to be honest, or that they're using it as a fishing expedition. The reason I raise the ICO's view of DSARs is that I think you need to have that in the back of your head, because sometimes we do see DSARs becoming quite contentious in terms of the way that they're being made, and also the responses that are being sent. So it sort of looks quasi-litigation in terms of people are getting very angry in relation to DSARs. And I think the one thing I would always say is don't litigate a DSAR. Essentially, understand how the ICO sees it, respond in a helpful way, be seen to be responding in a helpful way, even if you're doing it through gritted teeth, because I think that will, at least if you're taking a very measured approach in responding to DSARs, if a complaint is made, then that will obviously play well with the ICO. So I think it's always useful to understand how the ICO sees DSARs. One of the issues that we see as a particular issue with schools is taking the step back to make sure that the right person is making the DSAR. So a DSAR is the ability for an individual to access their own personal data. There is a perception with parents that they have the right to bring DSARs on behalf of children. And that's right to a certain degree in terms of when children are very young, because obviously they can't make a DSAR for themselves in relation to their personal data, and they wouldn't understand what they were getting back. But there comes a point at which the right person to make a DSAR is the child. Unfortunately, there is no hard and fast rule as to what that age might be, but I think sort of 12, 13, you need to be thinking about the understanding of the child. Does the child understand what a DSAR is? Do they understand what's likely to come back in response to a DSAR? And if so, they're the right person to be making the DSAR. So I think sometimes we do see schools getting a parental DSAR and dealing with it without taking that step back and thinking, are they the right person? If the right person to make the DSAR is the child, they can definitely authorise a third party to do it. And certainly we do see a lot of DSARs being made by parents under authorisation from the child or the student. And sometimes we also see DSARs being made by firms of solicitors. If the child is old enough to be making their own DSAR, both the parent and solicitor will need written authority to make the DSAR on behalf of the child. And I think one of the things that we found, certainly from experience, is that where it is a contentious issue and the child is has authorised a parent to make the DSAR, it's always useful to check with the child that they're happy, that they understand what the authority means, in that not only will the DSAR be made by the parent, but for example, the results of the DSAR will be made available to a parent. So for example, we've had a situation where a student authorised their mother to make a DSAR without realising that essentially what would be made available involved information about taking illegal drugs. So I think sometimes it's worth checking in with the child that they understand that this sort of data will be made available, and it will be made available to their parent, because sometimes they don't realise it. The other thing we've also seen, and sometimes it's worth checking in if you're concerned that the child may not understand what they're doing, is that they have been told that the DSAR is for a particular purpose and they've been misled by their parent. And in actual fact, there's some digging going on because maybe there are sort of issues between parents who may be separated or divorced, and they want to get hold of some information via a DSAR on the child as to how the school is dealing with the other parent. So I think it's always useful to sometimes, if you think that maybe the child doesn't understand what authority they've given, to check in with the child. Certainly what we would say is that there's also a question over identity verification. Don't do it in all circumstances, but in some circumstances you do need to do it. And the reason you need to do it is to make sure, one, you're providing the information about the right person, and two, DSARs have been used as a gateway to identity theft. So you have to take a proportionate approach, but I think it is worth thinking about in terms of, is it the right sort of DSAR to make an ID verification before you start doing it. So moving on to the next slide. The next thing that we would say is, once you've gone through the initial things in terms of a DSAR and receiving it and making sure it's the right person, and if it's, you know, if it's made about by a third party, you've got the right authorities, etc., is taking a step back and looking at the DSAR. So the first thing that I think you should be considering is, do you need to clarify anything in the DSAR? And then potentially looking at the DSAR to work out whether it's complex. Certainly, I would suggest you do them as soon as possible. Certainly clarification. The ICO doesn't really like it. So as you may well know, that you have a calendar month to respond to a DSAR. What the ICO doesn't really like is that you suddenly decide to clarify it when you're getting maybe 3 days out for the response point. So look at the actual DSAR early and work out whether or not you should be clarifying it. In terms of clarification, the ICO does have guidance. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that it is regularly updated, tweaked, because they add nuance and detail to it as to when you can clarify. In terms of clarifying, the current guidance is saying that you can clarify if the scope of the DSAR is unclear and you process a lot of data about the individual. So they don't have a lot of sympathy. The ICO doesn't have a lot of sympathy in terms of if somebody maybe a child has been there for a couple of months and suddenly you get a DSAR and then you decide you're going to clarify it, unless you genuinely don't understand what's being asked for in terms of the scope of the DSAR. I think it would be very difficult to convince the ICO that to do that would be an appropriate use of clarification. So that's the ICO's current position as to when it would be appropriate to clarify. When you clarify it, it pauses the timescale until you get a response. I think one thing that is worth noting, and we regularly get questions about it, is what happens if it goes into a black hole? What happens if we don't hear anything? So the ICO has been clear in its guidance now to say that if you ask for clarification and you hear nothing for a month, you can regard the DSAR as being closed, which may be useful in some circumstances. I think the other point to bear in mind is if you're only clarifying part of the DSAR, the scope of it, then you need to progress the other part of the DSAR. Don't hold back on everything. Essentially, move forward with the things that you are clear about. I think the other thing which is useful to bear in mind in terms of whether it's appropriate to clarify, the ICO has given a sort of test as to what would, when the circumstances that it would be appropriate to clarify, and that is whether, if you carried out a reasonable and proportionate search, would you provide the requested information, or would you not be able to locate it, or do you not understand what it is and couldn't carry out the search? So I think that's quite useful. One thing I will quickly mention, although I'm going to look at data protection reform later, is it is now very clear from a UK point of view in the new Data Use and Access Act that the search you carry out is a reasonable and proportionate search, which is quite useful. The other issue is extension, in terms of can you extend the time? And you shouldn't routinely do it in the same way you shouldn't routinely clarify. You have to have a rationale to do either of the things. So if you are wanting to extend, the basis for extension is essentially the DSAR is complex. Complexity is, again, there's quite a bit of guidance around it from the ICO point of view. Volume of itself does not make a DSAR complex. We regularly get asked, and quite often by schools, in terms of there's an awful lot of data, so we're definitely extending for complexity. Volume without something else doesn't make it complex in the view of the ICO. So the other things that are relevant as far as the ICO is concerned, which obviously are magnified by the fact if there's a lot of data, are things like there's technical difficulties obtaining the data. So for example, if something's been requested from archives and you have to go into archive data to get it out. If there are exemptions that you need to apply and they're not straightforward, particularly if it involves exemptions surrounding special category data or sensitive topics. Similarly, if you are trying to clarify issues around who you're disclosing to, and there's a parent and a legal guardian involved, that's one of the things. If that's a tricky issue, not if it's straightforward, but if that's a tricky issue. Equally, if there is an issue relating to medical data and you're going to be applying exemptions and there are issues about whether it should be disclosed. Equally, if you are having to get specialist legal advice to help you with the DSAR, that helps to justify clarification. Not if you always get legal advice, if it's outsourced and it's always done, but if you're getting specialist legal advice in relation to a particular issue relating to this particular DSAR. One thing that is relevant, but only for the public sector, is large volumes of unstructured paper data. If you've got to do that, that will make it complex. So, as I say, don't extend and say it's complex purely on the basis that there's a lot of data that you found as part of your search, but data plus these other volume plus these other things will mean that you can potentially extend for up to a further 2 calendar months. One thing to bear in mind is don't automatically take the 2 calendar months. If you can do it quicker, it always plays well with the ICO to say we're entitled to extend, we're going to do it for this period of time, and we're aiming to get something to you week commencing whatever. The other thing to bear in mind is that, as I've put on the slide, if there is personal data not affected by complexity, the ICO will expect you to send it within the initial timescale. So if part of it you can apply the complexity rule to, then you get the extension for that. But if anything is easy to provide, then that should go in the initial calendar month. And I think it's also useful to do that because it looks like you're progressing the DSAR. So should a complaint be made to the ICO, then obviously being seen to be doing something is always good. And certainly the other thing I would say to you is, while we're talking about complaints, and I know we're talking about parental complaints in education, but we do see a lot of people who immediately they don't get what they want from a DSAR will make a complaint to the ICO, some of which are actions, some of which are not. So moving on to the next slide, these are less sort of guidance and legal things, but more of practical tips in terms of what is good practice from the ICO's point of view and what will play well with the ICO. One of the things that we find useful is to be very clear at an early point in terms of what a DSAR entitles the individual to, because we do see a lot of phishing DSARs where they think they can get information that's not about themselves or their child, lots of information about staff and anything in terms of minutes of meetings within school that are not about them. And even sometimes if a solicitor is engaged, if they're not a specialist solicitor, from a data protection point of view, there is a perception that you can actually use it as a phishing expedition and ask for stuff that's not about the individual. So back to basics in terms of a DSAR is a request for information relating to that personal data, relating to that particular individual. It's not relating to all and sundry. And I think making that clear at an early stage means that what you don't get is, if you don't make that very clear, you send out the response and then they read it and then they've not got what they want, and then things become quite contentious. So I think it's always useful to manage expectations. The other thing is have an asset register, know where the data is. So if you get a DSAR, where are you going to be looking? And have a process. Most people will have some form of procedure for dealing with DSARs, but I think it needs to be widely known within the organisation. There needs to be training on a regular basis for those who are handling DSARs in terms of what the current ICO practice is. And essentially, I think having a process that runs well will make DSARs less painful. Also, the ICO expects you to have a process. So if you say to the ICO, well, we were late because we don't really know what we're doing and we can't find things and we can't search for things very easily, you don't get a lot of sympathy from the ICO in relation to that. Having a log of DSARs in terms of and stage and when it was sent out is also very useful, because if there's a complaint to the ICO again, they can ask to see things like this, and I think it's useful to have that. And also make sure that you are redacting and sending things securely. You'll have seen in the news that there was an issue recently in terms of data being disclosed, and it was hidden data on a document, but then it disclosed some quite sensitive information. So the ICO has issued guidance in terms of acceptable methods of redacting information. And finally, before I hand back, I think engaging with data subjects, sort of taking the emotion out of a DSAR, as I say, it can become quite contentious, and engage with the data subjects, tell them what you're doing, when you're doing it. If you're not going to be able to send it on the day that you say you're going to be able to send it, let them know when they can expect to receive it. Because one, it may well at least take some of the sort of feistiness out of the DSAR, but also with the ICO, keeping somebody up to date. If you're not quite able to hit the date, but you've told them when you'll be able to do it, and it's not too far in the future, will go down well with the ICO. And if they immediately get the complaint, as I say, it's quite often that complaints immediately go to the ICO, they're less likely to do anything about it, other than to say, make sure you actually do what you've now said you're going to do. So I think engaging with data subjects, again, as I say, whilst it may be through gritted teeth, I do think that it's something that helps with DSARs and helps manage them. So now I'm handing back, I think it's to Jenny. Is it to you, Jenny?
Yep, thank you. So lots of food for thought there, and hopefully some helpful guidance on how to navigate complaints and DSARs. We're just going to spend the last part of this session talking around unreasonable and vexatious complaints. And I think the reason for that's obvious. It's fed by the question that we asked earlier in the session as to whether these are becoming, whether the amount of unreasonable requests in terms of volume or the way in which complaints are being put across are becoming a big concern for you. I just wanted to talk about it from a people perspective, really. I work with a lot of schools, and a lot of schools will ask me for advice in relation to the staff and how staff are dealing with this. But a lot of it comes down to things such as parents demanding to speak only to certain people, or sending so many volume of emails through that it's becoming overwhelming for a particular staff member to deal with. I've had one head teacher who went off sick because they were just finding it really triggering coming in to get this the manner and the volume of emails from one particular parent who was being really aggressive in their tone and very demanding in their expectations, and they felt that they just couldn't cope with it. And that's not just one isolated instance. I've had a few. So when we're talking about vexatious complaints, I'd be saying, you know, almost harassing, repetitious to the point of it being unreasonable, excessive in the amount of demands being made, not wanting to listen, not wanting to engage, not, you know, so it's very easy, I think, to let that emotion take control. And I hear what you're saying, Joanne, about trying to remove that emotion from the requests, and something you also mentioned, Esther. So I'm just going to touch base on the employment aspects for a couple of minutes, and then we'll go through, and I'll just ask Esther if you could just comment on some top tips. And then Joanne, I know that vexatious complaints from a DSAR perspective is looked at differently, manifestly unfounded, I think, or unreasonable. You'll correct me, I know, when we get to that. But yeah, we'll just give you some headline tips. The slides will be coming out to you. And what I would say is we can help when it gets to this level. Sometimes that middle person can be really useful just to help take some control back. So next slide, please, Lisa. From an employment perspective, we hear of, I mean, we hear through our casework, but also I think it's widely reported, and these are some stats coming through from a survey that I found. Personal attacks on staff is increasing with a level of aggression. So attacks don't need to be physical, they can be verbal. The amount of excessive and complex emails coming through, unrealistic demands such as calling for staff to be dismissed. I've had that quite a few times. And multiple complaints about the same issue, so that it just feels really overwhelming in terms of how you even deal with this on top of everything else that you need to deal with in your day-to-day. The purpose of this session is to try and alleviate some of that by giving you some of the tips that Esther and Joanne have given so far in this session. But I wanted to remind you that we also need to be very internal focused in terms of how we're supporting staff who are impacted by those complaints. So next slide, please. So 90% of school leaders say complaints handling is having a detrimental impact on staff well-being. And I see from a lot of the cases I support on where staff are on long-term sick or reporting work-related stress, that often it's because of workload, but workload being not just the heavy workload of teaching and planning, etc., but the extra bits that are coming through, including demanding parents and also the demands from leadership because of those demands and pressures, I suppose, from a sense perspective as well, that's impacting on how they feel about work and how they feel they can add value and bring their best selves to work. We've had reports of this aggressive behaviour, which I've mentioned, and all of that ultimately can result in staff absence. And we know that when people are off sick for a long period, it's harder to get them back. Managing staff absence really, really well is key, and that means right from the very beginning, supporting staff in a really good way so that you'll keep that level of communication and hopefully keep staff on side with you so they want to come back and they see that that is a genuine option and they see that they will be supported in that. So having good absence management processes in place is key. Where complaints mean that there is a disciplinary allegation against a member of staff, dealing with that again sensitively, carefully, whilst compliant with the complaints process, but also compliant with your disciplinary investigations, not assuming guilt until guilt has been proven under that process, and providing adequate wellbeing support to individuals concerned. if people are suffering with stress and anxiety because of these kind of things and additional pressures in the day-to-day, it can impact on reduced productivity, reduced engagement. That can lead to people leaving, which can also impact, obviously, your recruitment, retention, complexities, which I know is already an issue within the sector. But I just wanted to, so all of this means that we need to reflect on well-being, and I'll pick up on that in a second. So next slide, please. Two things I just really wanted to flag. All employers have a duty of care to their staff. You have a duty to provide a safe place of work, and that includes mental and physical. And if you don't do enough to maintain that safe place of work, then there are claims that can follow. One of those claims could be individuals could resign and claim constructive dismissal on the basis that you've broken trust and confidence in failing to act under that duty of care. And that's the claim that they can bring, and there's compensation that follows in relation to it. If the things that have made them feel that they haven't been adequately supported by you as their employer, and the things that they're complaining about are discriminatory treatment by a third party, such as parents or indeed pupils, and you've been aware of it and haven't done enough of it, they could also add you into a discrimination complaint on the basis of your failure to act has almost created that discriminatory environment. That's the current position, but what I just did want to flag that under the Employment Rights Bill, which is a massive piece of legislation going through at the moment, and there's loads to talk about from an employment perspective there, but one key thing is third-party harassment. So in approximately a year, employers will be liable for the acts of third parties who harass their staff on protected grounds. So sexist comments, ageist comments, disablest comments, and it's not just comments, actually, it's any acts that create that unwanted environment for staff. So we need to be really careful about ensuring that just because these are third parties, if it's impacting on our staff, it's creating that unwanted environment for staff, we need to be doing all that we reasonably can to prevent it. And prevention means you need to start thinking about that now. So picking up on some of the themes that Joanne and Esther have talked about is going to be really key to that, as well as training your staff on how to deal with complaints, giving them some resilience support and putting in place some of the systems that we can just touch upon in a moment to help you have some rigor around how you support your staff in dealing with these matters. I'm conscious of time and we are going to run a little bit over, so I do apologise for that. Hopefully you can stay on for no more than 10 minutes, but we're going to move on to just give you some tips in relation to dealing with these vexatious and unreasonable complaints. And just some practical points before we close at the end of the session. If you did need to leave, I'd really encourage you to fill out the feedback form because we'll make sure you get all your questions answered. But hopefully you can stay on. So Esther, can I just pass to you on that note then? So we really need to bottom out these unreasonable and vexatious complaints and support staff in how they deal with them. So if you could just give us your top tips, then I'll turn to you, Joanne, in terms of top tips on unreasonable DSARs, and then time permitting, we'll just touch on if there's any improvements in law reform on the horizon, which may be a glimmer of hope. Esther.
Thanks, Jenny. I think you already mentioned that one of the really important things is to have a sort of parental behavioural policy in place, and so that those expectations are set. And again, that I feel like setting expectations just across the board, whether it's we know about pupil behaviour policies, but actually ones for parents are vital. I've just got a list here of some of the ones I've seen in the past in a kind of parental behaviour policy that is really just flagging actually we are not going to accept this sort of behaviour. And I think I'll just read a few of them. Obviously treating school staff with courtesy and respect, pretty basic. Respecting the needs and well-being of the rights of pupils, staff and parents, and within school hours. Also the needs and well-being and rights of pupils and staff beyond school hours. Avoiding any use or threatened use of violence to people or property. It's a bit shocking that we have to say that, but I think people need, reminding what is and is not acceptable. Avoiding intimidation, aggression, verbal or written abuse, I have seen it all, and it can be really shocking. I think parents can lose perspective when it comes to their children, and I've seen some pretty horrifying behaviour. Also, for them to recognise the time constraints with which school staff that they work and allow reasonable time to be responding to issues within school, that it is okay that you can't answer their email instantly. Recognise that resolving a specific problem can sometimes take time, and obviously following the complaints procedure in case of complaint. And that works both ways. I've certainly seen schools that aren't following their complaints process, and I find that frustrating, because that's giving certainty to everyone, and just respect the time allowances for dealing with complaints. Next slide, please. Thanks. I've set out some of the risks and legal considerations. So, okay, well, what could go wrong? I think I've touched on what could go wrong, and what could go wrong is that you need me, public lawyer. So ineffective complaint handling can cause relationship breakdowns between parents and school staff. Staff harassment, Jenny has mentioned. There have been some awful cases, that particular head teacher in the press who's being harassed by a parent. That was really, really shocking. But also future legal actions such as discrimination claims, and that's where I'm seeing it. And I feel like discrimination cases attract a sort of a certain caliber of parents sometimes, and they are often on the more vexatious side. Those kind of they complain about everything, and they complain all the way through the discrimination case, just as they've complained, previously up to that point. There are some strategies that I think help and will mitigate. So please do keep good contemporaneous records. Get your CPOMs in order, or your records, and adopt a clear communication. Follow, as I said already, the complaints procedure. Please follow it, and get some legal advice if it's becoming too much, and get it early. Don't wait until the discrimination case has hit your inbox. And mediation. I can't rave enough about mediation. When things have started going badly wrong, before you get to legal action, mediation can be a really good way of trying to talk through the issues. I can't promise it will resolve everything, but I've been really impressed with some of the education mediation outcomes that I've seen. So there's things that I recommend to schools to put in place when they've got that parent, that vexatious complainant, and they're struggling. And I would suggest communication protocols or strategies, sometimes they're known as. They can be really useful, and the sort of things, it could be just the parent that emails 5 times a day is then limited to 1 email a week. It might be that they get 1 phone call a week. You might want to have like a central email address that they have to use, rather than the head teacher's email or the main reception email. But I think certainly, we can even have suggestions. You can even block emails if you need to. There's a whole range, and it might be that they're able to use Class Dojo to communicate with the teacher, but they're not going to be allowed to send excessive emails. So there can be a whole list of criteria as you consider fit or deem appropriate, but there are ways of controlling this. And also, if you've got a really aggressive, threatening parent, and that your staff are feeling intimidated, you have it within your gift to be banning parents from the school site. Obviously, that you don't take that step lightly. I've just put the link in there to it's under section 547 of the Education Act 1996. But again, there's guidance around controlling access to the school premises. That is something you can do. I have seen that there are circumstances where that is going to be appropriate. So be proactive. That's my main tip. We said transparent. I feel like we said transparent quite a lot, but be transparent with the complaints process. Safeguard your staff, students, and that will also, look after the school's reputation as well. Next slide, please. So I've got some key takeaways in terms of, you know, what we're seeing with the complaints, and I would say I've seen so many discrimination cases against schools in the last year. It's been quite shocking, that really I think it is this. We've got systematic challenges going on in education. They do reflect those wider systematic issues. We've talked about funding shortages, lack of specialist support, you know, there's a lack of special schools. There's also, you know, we've got, this is putting a strain on the parent-school relationships, you know, and we talked about being set up to fail, and I do think that is the case for schools, and things hopefully are changing and are going to change, but it doesn't happen quickly. So I've also mentioned that importance of early intervention, streamlined complaints process, and resolving conflicts and trying to prevent the escalation, whether it is getting in with, you know, informal meetings or setting up mediation. You know, if you've got those complaints happening, we probably know where it's going. That you know, need for sector-wide reforms is absolutely, you know, evident, and I'm hopeful that change is on the horizon, and do, you know, adopt those best practice approaches, and you know, that will better protect your staff and students. So I think those are some of my key takeaways. Next slide, please. I think over to Joanne.
Thanks, Esther. I'm going to give a really quick canter through this. So you can refuse a DSAR if it is manifestly unfounded or it's manifestly excessive. I think the key word is manifestly, certainly from the ICO point of view, is that it has to clearly be one of those things in order for you to refuse it. Manifestly unfounded, essentially, there are two tests, which is either the individual has no genuine information in terms of accessing their personal data. So, for example, they've made a DSAR just to leverage a settlement. Unfortunately, most people don't say, I've put in a DSAR, but if you give me 20 grand, then I'll withdraw it, even though you know that's the background. The other side of it is that there is some sort of malice to it in terms of to harass individuals or disrupt things. One thing that's worth bearing in mind, unfortunately, is the ICO is clear that the fact that abusive or aggressive language is used does not of itself make it manifestly unfounded. So some of that, if you're getting very aggressive DSARs, won't automatically make it manifestly unfounded. The other one is manifestly excessive, and that one I think is in some ways trickier to deal with than manifestly unfounded. Just because people have requested a lot of information doesn't make it manifestly excessive. Regularly get asked in terms of they've asked for quite a lot of data, can we just turn around and say no? The answer to that is no. You have to look at the request in the round in terms of the information that is requested. Essentially, what would be the consequences on the individual in terms of not providing it? What sort of impact will it have on you to have to find all of that information? Does it repeat previous requests? Essentially, there's a sort of whole host of things that you have to take into consideration in terms of whether it's manifestly excessive. One of the other alternatives, if you don't want to refuse the DSAR, is to potentially charge for a response, and it is possible to do that, but it's certainly not a large fee that you can charge. So yeah, there is a way out of dealing with DSARs which are sort of more vexatious, but it's not easy, and the ICO would prefer that the DSAR were cut back or managed in a different way than you refusing to deal with it. So
Great, that's me now then, Joanne.
Yep.
Thank you. I just thought we'd close with this slide, and then I'll point you to a couple of slides which Joanne and Esther have prepared, which just flags some of the reform on the horizon. I think we've had lots of tips today in terms of setting expectations, clear communication, removing the emotion out of it. You've heard about trying some informal resolution and guidance as to how to navigate what is in a DSAR, what's not, and how to respond if you feel that it's excessive. So loads and loads of tips within there. And just to close off on those tips, these are just some food for thought. I just wanted to flag that Joanne does some DSAR training, which is excellent. So if you did want to go into in-depth support for you as an organisation and understanding that and training your staff up, that's really affordable and accessible as training. And I know Esther also does training on send and complaints and all kind of things in her area. So if you were interested in getting a bit more of tailored support, please do reach out to either Joanne or Esther, and you can do that on the feedback form that you've got the links for. From a people perspective, I think it's just understanding the controllables and working with them so that they don't feel that it's all on them. Maybe think about some of the systems you can put in place internally. So key point of contacts, making sure that if particular emails or conduct from a particular parent is triggering for a member of staff, that they're supported through your wellbeing resources. And that maybe in terms of how those complaints are coming through. So I've heard of complaint coordinators, for example. Parental help desks is on the side of the parental complaint side of things, a way in which those complaints can come through particular channels, which make it more manageable, perhaps. You've heard Esther talk about CPOMs. I know that from Joanne's point of view, CPOMs also can be problematic. I don't know if you just want a very, very, very quick mention on that, Joanne.
Super fast. So super quick on CPOMs is sometimes we find there's a lot of information on there that's not actually about the child, and we do see in contentious DSARs that people want to see CPOMs to find out information about the other parent, for example, if they're separated. CPOMs data needs to be handled very carefully, and redactions need to be thought about in terms of providing it in response to a DSAR.
Brilliant, thank you. And CCTV, can you mention that in 30 seconds?
Oh, CCTV is a nightmare. Essentially, we see a lot of CCTV requests, and I think you need a strategy about CCTV would be what I would say. And I think also you need to think about what your retention policy is on CCTV, because obviously if it's been overwritten or it's been deleted and you have a policy around that, once it's gone, it's gone. So, you know, if the DSAR is made a week later and it was deleted 3 days earlier, you're not going to be able to get it back, and that would be fine. So I think CCTV, I could say a lot about CCTV, but I think have a strategy around CCTV.
Okay, and then very, very finally, Esther, there are some future reforms on the horizon. We haven't got time to go through the detail, and it is just future reforms, but presumably you feed in regular updates about those reforms coming through. Lisa, if you could just turn to that slide, that would be brilliant. Just whilst Esther says maybe 30 seconds on what we can expect to perhaps see coming. The slide before and before that. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, there was a really interesting article came out quite recently looking at the kind of the well, hopefully a planned overhaul on the way, and really that they're hoping to improve, you know, the effectiveness for all parties. I think the government, Bridget Phillipson, she acknowledges that the complaints are massively on the rise, and that hopefully there will be clearer guidance for parents and to require evidence before complaints escalate. And we don't know what it's going to look like, but we've come up with a bit of a wish list. I'll let you read the wish list in your own time, but I think one of the key wishes on the wish list is around, you know, the kind of we've talked a lot about this kind of vexatious complaints. Obviously it's really important to have a vexatious policy at the moment, but unless it's a completely different issue, you can't exclude parents permanently, unfortunately, and you do have to deal, if the complaints are separate, you have to deal with them. If legal action's on the same issue, you can pause the complaint. But one of our key wishes is really this change in the definition of vexatious, so that actually that can be acknowledged, and that it might, you know, it might stop having to deal with such a huge volume from the same person, because at the moment we do, you know, if they're all different complaints, even if there's loads of them, we have to look at them. Thanks, Jen.
That's great, thank you. Joanne will be talking about data changes coming up in her session, where there's a bigger opportunity to ask any questions you've got about data. what you've heard today, please send those questions through. You can put them in the feedback form, and hopefully Joanne will be able to reflect those in that more detailed session. And there's some new legislation from DSARs, which Joanne will be presumably talking through in a lot more detail. So I think on that note, we will close. If you could log your feedback if you've got any. I do apologise we've run out of time, but there was so much to cover. If you want to know more about what we do from an education perspective, there is a link there which we will send through as part of our follow-up, and you will get a copy of the slides and the recording. Please share it with anybody you think that this might be useful for. And if from an employment perspective you're interested just to keep up to date with all the changes on the Employment Rights Bill, including third-party harassment, you can sign up to all of our employment events using that link there. So thank you ever so much for joining us today. Hope you have found it useful and supportive, and please do reach out to us if we can help. Thank you.